From the outside, the Kahler family was the embodiment of success, beauty, and perfection. Neighbors admired them, friends envied them, and strangers dreamed of having their life. But behind that dazzling facade was a storm of secrets, manipulation, and simmering anger. When the cracks in that seemingly perfect life became too large to hide, it didn't just shatter a family, it led to a tragedy that shocked the public. James Christa Kahler was the patriarch of the family who seemed to have it all, with a six-figure salary and a stable career. He was the one who provided the dream life for his entire family. His wife was Karen, a perfect homemaker who cared for their three children, Emily, Lauren, and Sin. From straight-A report cards to outstanding local sports achievements, the Kahler children seemed to thrive under their parents' guidance. As you delve into this story, you will learn how a perfect family was built on sacrifice, compromise, and horrific silent struggles. You're watching True Crime Stories 678, where we explore the most mysterious cases and the most thrilling stories. And as always, before we start decoding the mysteries of today's case, please leave a like and a subscribe to support us. Now, let's clarify every detail of the case. James Christa and Karen were married in December 1885, then moved to Colorado, where James Christa landed a promising job. At that time, Karen was still in her sophomore year of college, with many years left until graduation, but she couldn't handle a long-distance relationship. Therefore, Karen dropped out of school to focus on her marriage and James Christa's career.
It was a sacrifice she accepted with all her heart, determined to build a happy life with her husband. Their first major milestone came on April 8, 1991, when Karen gave birth to their first child, Emily. Life seemed perfect. James Grice's career continued to soar, and Karen took on the role of a full-time stay-at-home mom. However, Karen's mother noticed that Karen always put James Grice's needs above her own, even when she had just given birth. That didn't seem right. It was as if Karen was no longer living for herself. By 1992, James Grice's career brought an attractive job opportunity in Greenville, Texas. The family moved there in May 1993. They welcomed their second daughter, Lauren. However, beneath that seemingly peaceful surface, simmering tensions gradually emerged. One of them was a disagreement about having more children. Karen felt their family was complete with 2 children, but James Grice wanted one more. Due to the difference in opinion, the two agreed to a written agreement. Karen agreed to have one more child on the condition that she could undergo a procedure to prevent future pregnancies. James Grice agreed, and in March 1999, their son Sin was born.
To honor their agreement, James Grice then had a vasectomy. By this time, life seemed to have stabilized. The next job opportunity brought James Grice and his family to Water Fork, Texas, a peaceful suburb near Joliet. Once again, Karen adapted and immersed herself in the life of the new community. She joined a local moms group and later became its president, building a strong network of friends and resources. Karen also ensured that her children were always actively involved in activities. Emily excelled in academics and music, Lauren stood out in sports and band, and Sin became a bright star in baseball. From the outside, their family looked quite perfect. But James Grice was always obsessed with perfection and set extremely high standards for everyone, including his family. As for Lauren, who struggled with attention deficit disorder, ADD, she didn't achieve the straight-A report cards like Emily, so she was frequently criticized by James Grice. To James Grice, Lauren was not good enough, and he didn't hesitate to mock her for it. James Grice's control didn't just stop at his family. People began to see him as a rigid, rude, and almost arrogant person. James Grice had little respect for female leaders, even saying they didn't belong in those positions. James Grice was also known for being cheap, borrowing things instead of buying them. He would go with friends to strip clubs and demand they pay for the performances. Despite earning a stable salary of $180,000 a year, James Grice still tightly controlled the family's finances. Karen had to live on a strict weekly allowance, and had to keep all receipts every time she went shopping.
James Grice would review every single receipt when he got home. If he found something unnecessary or too expensive, he would fly into a rage. But the problem wasn't just about money. James Grice's control extended to every aspect of life, even their intimate life. Every night at 8:30 p.m., Karen had to be in bed to perform their routine. If she didn't do what he wanted, she would pay the price. Just as James Grice often said, things happened so regularly that even her children knew not to bother them after 8:30 p.m. Even when Karen was sick, she still had to comply with James Grice's demands. Refusing him was dangerous. James Grice's anger often turned into violence, and Karen understood that giving in was the easier way to keep the peace. But it wasn't always like this. When they first got together, Karen's life wasn't so excessively controlled. However, over time, James Grice's demands became more and more extreme. He even suggested bringing a third person, specifically a woman, into the relationship so he could watch Karen and that person be intimate. Karen felt uncomfortable with this idea, but she couldn't refuse. She wanted her own space, so she secretly joined a gym.
Karen loved sports, and this was a way for her to regain some control over her life. However, James Grice, with his controlling nature, refused to pay for the gym membership, so Karen did odd jobs to earn the money herself. By January 2006, she had saved enough to join Powerhouse Gym and quickly became a regular. Not long after, she also became a part-time personal trainer. Surprisingly, James Grice did not object to Karen working at the gym, but he set one condition. She had to be home before the kids returned from school, and as usual, Karen always fulfilled her duties perfectly. She quickly made friends with people at the gym and often talked about James Grice. Karen said that James Grice was always grumpy, that no matter how hard she tried, she could never please him, and they argued frequently. But the arguments between them were so intense that sometimes the children had to intervene to stop them. On bad days, the conflict could escalate to violence, and Karen's body often showed bruises. Everyone at the gym knew about Karen's unhappiness and her desire to escape the suffocating relationship. But James Grice's tight control made it difficult for her to leave. Karen had nearly reached her breaking point, and things only got worse when she met a personal trainer named Sonny.
Sonny was calm and understanding, helping Karen open up about the darkest parts of her relationships, things that Karen had never been able to share with anyone. Gradually, the relationship between Karen and Sonny crossed the boundary of friendship. The two developed a romantic relationship and even became intimate. There are many theories about how this relationship began. Some suggest that James Grice encouraged it, after he had previously suggested Karen bring a third person into the relationship. Others believe that Karen and Sonny had started their affair before James Grice found out. Regardless of how it started, the relationship eventually evolved into a threesome. James Grice even sent flirtatious texts to Sonny, bought flowers for both women, and encouraged them to go on weekend trips together. However, James Grice later denied that he had intentionally pushed Karen and Sonny together. Although the relationship between Karen and Sonny was public, James Grice told a different story. He claimed that Karen was the one destroying their marriage, and that the biggest problem was that the perfect family image he had worked so hard to build was collapsing. In 2008, James Grice saw an opportunity to regain control. He received a job offer in Columbia, Missouri, with a higher salary than his current job, and it would also separate Karen from Sonny. James Grice immediately accepted the offer. Karen, however, felt devastated.
She didn't want to leave Sonny, and furthermore, didn't want to leave behind what she had built in Waterfork. Her children were actively involved in school activities. Karen also had deep ties with local volunteer groups. However, as usual, James Grice had the final say. James Grice moved to Columbia a few months ahead, leaving Karen behind to handle everything. During this time, Karen and Sonny decided to maintain a long-distance relationship, and James Grice was completely unaware. He believed it was just a fleeting affair, and that once the two were separated,
Karen would return to being his obedient wife. When Karen moved to Columbia with the children, James Grice believed everything was back to normal. He even allowed Karen to enroll at the University of Missouri to get a degree in health science and continue working as a fitness trainer. However, after spending so much time with Sonny, Karen had experienced a taste of freedom she had never had before. She was no longer satisfied with only being allowed to go to school or work. Karen did not want a life where James Grice gave himself the right to control her every move. When James Grice realized he was gradually losing control over Karen, he began to tighten his grip even more. James Grice became so obsessed that he monitored every detail of Karen's life, like who she was talking to and what was in her email. And this completely violated Karen's privacy.
This toxic obsession peaked in December 2008. At a New Year's Eve party at an old friend's house in Waterford, James Grice and Karen did not expect to see Sonny at the party, but when they walked in, she was there. The last person James Grice wanted to face. Things got even worse when Karen openly showed affection for Sonny. They laughed, hugged, drank from the same glass, and even sat close together in front of everyone. At this point, James Grice went ballistic. His jealousy and rage exploded. In James Grice's mind, this was an unbearable humiliation. James Grice's anger erupted right at the party. He screamed in Karen's face, and she screamed back. This was no longer a private argument, but had become a spectacle for all the guests. The argument became so intense that James Grice, in his anger and humiliation, publicly announced that Karen was having an affair. In retaliation, Karen kissed Sonny right in front of everyone. The host felt uncomfortable and asked them to leave the party.
But the drama didn't end there. The argument continued outside, and it quickly escalated into violence. In a fit of rage, James Grice pushed Karen hard, causing her to fall and hit her head on the ground. The next morning, both were stunned by what had happened. Although things had become chaotic, Karen began to rethink how she was challenging James Grice. Karen told Sonny they needed to pause their relationship, but Sonny wouldn't accept that. She insisted that the problem wasn't Karen, but James Grice. Sonny was very worried for Karen's safety, especially after witnessing James Grice's violent outbursts. Therefore, at the end of January 2009, Karen made the brave decision to file for divorce. Despite this, she didn't leave the house immediately, but began sleeping in a separate room. At the same time, Karen continued to maintain her long-distance relationship with Sonny. James Grice, with his obsessive-compulsive nature, relentlessly monitored Karen's email and even rummaged through her belongings. Every time Karen planned to meet Sonny, James Grice would follow them and try to sabotage their plans. At work, James Grice became increasingly unstable. He would often carry a family photo album to show his colleagues, saying things like, "Isn't this a happy family? Why would Karen want to destroy such a happy family?" James Grice's bizarre behavior made everyone uncomfortable, but he didn't notice or care.
Tensions peaked in March 2009 after James Grice gave a speech at a city council meeting. Karen went there to support him, but was dragged into a fiery argument. This time, James Grice's anger turned violent. He assaulted Karen, forcing her to call the police. James Grice was arrested on charges of third-degree domestic assault. In her statement to the police, Karen explained that James Grice's behavior had become increasingly violent and controlling. Although James Grice denied the assault, claiming he just wanted to hug Karen, the marks on Karen's body served as evidence against him. James Grice was immediately arrested. Karen moved out of the house, took the children with her, and rented a place on the other side of Columbia. She also withdrew $50,000 from their bank account, determined to escape James Grice's toxic control. The arrest of James Grice was a huge shock. As a city official, his insane behavior shocked the public. When his bizarre and disturbing behavior at work was revealed, the situation worsened. The city eventually issued a public statement that James Grice had resigned due to family issues. But the truth was much more complicated. In reality, he had been fired. He did not resign voluntarily. James Grice could not stand the fact that his previously perfect reputation had been destroyed. No more job, no more family, and no more control over anything. He packed his things, left the house,
and returned to his mother's farm in Kansas. James Grice hoped that the hard work on the farm would help him clear his head, but the distance only intensified his obsession with Karen, his ex-wife. James Grice couldn't understand why Karen left him. In James Grice's mind, he was the perfect husband. He provided everything for Karen, yet Karen still left. James Grice refused to recognize that it was his own controlling behavior that had pushed Karen to the edge. He continued to tear her down, secretly reading her text messages, emails, and even her cards. James Grice couldn't let go, and he blamed everything on Sonny. James Grice began calling Karen and Sonny derogatory and bigoted names, even though he himself had previously agreed to the relationship between Karen and Sonny. What really drove James Grice crazy was that his daughters were starting to turn against him. The children were fed up with his control and wanted to make their own decisions in life. Emily, the oldest daughter, was the first to break free from his control. She chose a college that he did not approve of, showing that she would no longer live by his rules. To James Grice, this was like a slap in the face. He blamed Karen and claimed she had brainwashed their daughter against him.
Things got even worse when one of the daughters posted on Facebook admitting she was bisexual. Instead of being supportive, James Grice saw this as another reason to attack. James Grice began building a massive file against Karen, collecting over 3,500 pages of so-called evidence to give to his divorce lawyer. This file included screenshots of private messages between Karen and Sonny, along with notes on every time Karen met Sonny. James Grice even claimed the two women had been intimate in front of the children, but he offered no proof to back this up. James Grice's behavior became increasingly bizarre and alarming. He said that friends wanted to get rid of Sonny, but no one really paid attention or took it seriously. This is a familiar pattern in such cases. People often ignore the warning signs until it's too late. It's noteworthy that despite his rage towards Karen and Sonny, James Grice was still involved with several other women. His behavior was very strange, but when it came to his son, Sin, things seemed different. According to James Grice, Sin was the only one who hadn't completely turned his back on him. James Grice tried to spend time with Sin, taking him hunting and fishing. Although James Grice had been a terrible husband to Karen and a distant, controlling father to his daughters, he still tried to be a decent father to Sin. It seems Sin was James Grice's last ray of hope, the only bond he hadn't completely destroyed.
Time passed until Thanksgiving 2009. While Sin was with James Grice, Karen was still trying to maintain family ties and wanted all her children and her girlfriend, Sonny, to visit their grandmother, Dorothy, during the holiday. So, the day after Thanksgiving, Karen went to James Grice's house to pick up Sin and take him to Dorothy's house. Dorothy, 89 at the time, lived on a quiet farm in Burlingame, Kansas, a small town with fewer than 1,000 residents. But on Saturday, November 29, 2009, a deputy sheriff was finishing paperwork when he received a dispatch call about a crime at Dorothy's house. When police arrived at the scene, the first person they saw was Dorothy. She was lying on the kitchen floor, blood everywhere, having been shot multiple times. She was still alive, but her condition was critical. They proceeded into the house and found Karen. She had been shot twice and died at the scene. In the living room, they discovered 18-year-old Emily lying behind the sofa. She had also been shot twice and did not survive. Then, the deputy heard a faint voice calling for help from upstairs. It was 16-year-old Lauren, still alive, but her injuries were extremely severe. Like Dorothy, Lauren had also been shot multiple times and was desperately clinging to life. As she was being rushed to the hospital, Lauren whispered a name, James Grice. When asked who James Grice was, she weakly replied, "My father." However, not long after, Lauren also succumbed to her severe injuries. Dorothy, who had fought with all her strength to hold on to life, finally passed away shortly thereafter. This left Sin as the sole survivor of the family, an unwitting witness to this senseless massacre. According to Sin's account, He and Karen were sitting together cleaning a pile of old coins when the nightmare began. James Gright burst in through the back door carrying a rifle and opened fire on Karen. In the chaos, Sin fled in terror, trying to find a way to escape. He ran to Karen's phone to call for help, but before he could do anything, more gunshots rang out through the house. In mortal fear, Sin knew he had to get out of there. He bolted to the neighbor's house next door to get help.
Immediately, an emergency search warrant was issued for James Gright. It wasn't long before authorities found his car abandoned in a secluded area. Inside the car, police discovered a large amount of ammunition, sedatives, and a backpack filled with essential items like soap, toilet paper, and canned food, as if he was planning something. However, James Gright himself was nowhere to be found. A few hours later, James Gright was spotted wandering aimlessly on a deserted road, looking dazed and lost. When he saw the police approaching, he didn't run. Instead, he said, "I'm the one you're looking for," and was arrested without any resistance. James Gright's defense team argued that his psychological issues, including depression and a personality disorder, had pushed him to the brink. They claimed that James Gright had suffered a breakdown, losing the ability to control his actions. However, the prosecution painted a much darker picture. They described James Gright as a ruthless man whose actions were cold and calculated. To bolster their argument, the prosecution presented a key piece of evidence. James Gright's psychiatrist, a leading expert, testified that although James Gright suffered from depression, he was fully capable of planning the massacre. The fact that he spared Sin's life was a crucial detail, proving his actions were premeditated, not impulsive. 2 years after the massacre, the final trial began. Sin, then 12 years old, showed extraordinary courage by taking the stand to recount the horrific events. With shocking clarity, the boy described the moment he witnessed his father shoot his mother and the chaos that followed. Sin's testimony dissolved all doubt. James Gright's actions were not a spur-of-the-moment impulse or a temporary loss of control, but the result of months of festering anger and calculated intent. Sonny also testified, revealing the abusive relationship between Karen and James Gright. She recounted her efforts to protect Karen from James Gright's violent behavior, and also stated that James Gright initially seemed indifferent when she and Karen began their relationship. However, his attitude completely changed, becoming hostile, tense, and aggressive when Karen decided to leave him.
However, Sonny also admitted that her testimony was based mainly on her memory and what Karen had told her, with no physical evidence to support it. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. James Gright was guilty of capital murder. The insanity defense was rejected, and James Gright faced the strictest possible sentences, the death sentence or life in prison without parole. James Gright showed no emotion as he heard the final verdict. The death sentence was handed down as payment for the act of shooting 4 family members. Sin stood up in court, his voice steady but full of emotion. He said, "I don't want my dad to be sentenced to death because that would be very painful for my grandparents. I don't want my family to disappear." These words, uttered by a child who had witnessed so much suffering, stunned many in the courtroom. Despite James Gright's brutal actions, Sin still saw him as a father who had once been kind and had loved his family. Meanwhile, James Gright showed no remorse for what he had done or the lives he had taken. After being sentenced, he began writing letters to many people, including the lead prosecutor of the case. But these letters were not apologies. On the contrary, James Gright declared that he felt relieved about what he had done, insisting that he had freed Sin from what he called a toxic environment. James Gright's defense team quickly filed an appeal with the Kansas Supreme Court. They argued that the jury was biased and that James Gright's mental health issues had not been adequately considered during the trial. However, the court did not agree. In the end, James Gright had to face the consequences of his actions. His appeal was denied, and his other legal options were nearly exhausted. Currently, James Gright is still awaiting execution on death row. Justice has been served, but does that truly balance the loss? We can only hope that James Gright's final days will be filled with the haunting memory of the crimes he committed, as retribution for the pain he left behind. As for Sin, his story is a testament to incredible strength and resilience. Despite facing unimaginable trauma and hardship,
Sin overcame it all. He graduated from high school and is now working in Kansas, becoming a living symbol of the will and energy to overcome adversity. What do you guys think about this ruthless killer? Leave your opinions right in the comments section to discuss. And before you go, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to keep up with the next videos on True Crime Stories 678.